In this video, we're actually going to do a continuation of example 6 with 2 additional problems. So first we're going to start with part A, and then we'll move on to part B. Before I work this out, I want you to pause the video and try to solve part A and B by yourself. Alright, so let's try to do A. So the first thing I'm going to need is common denominators. So the one on the left is going to need 1 minus secant of x. And the one on the right is going to need 1 plus secant of x. So very carefully when I multiply these, I'm actually not going to distribute them just quite yet. I'm going to write this as cosecant of x times 1 minus secant. And because I know I'm going to get common denominators, I'm going to write it as one fraction. And then all divided by 1 minus secant of x and 1 plus secant of x. So at this point, I'm now going to distribute. So I'm going to get cosecant of x minus cosecant of x times secant of x plus, and now I'm going to distribute this one, cosecant of x plus cosecant of x times secant of x, and then all divided by, and now I'm going to distribute out the denominators as well. So if you notice, this is similar to a minus b times a plus b, which gives you a squared minus b squared because they're conjugates. So I'm going to get 1 squared minus secant squared. And so now I'm just going to do some simplifying. This term cancels with this term. And notice that I have 1 cosecant and 2 cosecants. So I get 2 cosecant of x, all divided by 1 minus secant squared of x. And already this is looking much, much nicer. When I see a 1 and a trig function squared, my brain should think Pythagorean identities. So the Pythagorean identity I'm going to use needs to involve secant squared. And I know that secant squared is equal to 1 plus tangent squared. Now keep in mind, my goal is to create 1 minus secant squared. That's my goal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the secant squared over here, and I'm going to take this tangent and I'm going to put it over here. So step by step, I'm going to subtract secant squared from both sides. And I'm going to get 0 is equal to 1 plus tangent squared of x minus secant squared of x. And then I'm going to subtract tangent squared of x from both sides. And I'm going to get negative tangent squared is equal to 1 minus secant squared. Now there's other ways to do this. You can manipulate them differently as long as you end up getting 1 minus secant squared. So now that's going to turn my fraction into 2 cosecant of x divided by negative tangent squared. And this is still kind of a mess, so I'm going to clean it up. This is going to be negative 2 cosecant of x times cotangent squared. And that's it. You're all done. Okay, now we're going to work out the next one. So same idea. I need common denominators. So I'm going to multiply the left one by 1 plus secant of x over 1 plus secant of x. And I'm going to multiply the right one by 1 minus secant of x. Now very, very carefully, I'm going to multiply the numerators. So secant, I'm going to distribute, and I get secant of x plus secant squared of x minus, I'm going to put a parenthesis, and I'm going to go ahead and distribute this one now, and I'm going to get secant of x minus secant squared of x, and all divided by my denominator, which is 1 plus secant of x times 1 minus secant of x. Okay, so then I'm going to distribute this negative, and I get secant of x plus secant squared of x minus secant of x plus secant squared of x, all divided by, and from the previous example, we saw that this is 1 minus secant squared of x. Okay? So now we're going to combine like terms. This secant is going to cancel with this negative secant. And then I have 1 secant squared here and another secant squared here. So I'm going to get 2 secant squared divided by, and in the previous example, we saw that 1 minus secant squared is negative tangent squared. So now I'm going to clean it up, and this is going to be negative 2 secant squared of x times cotangent squared of x. It's still kind of messy. I'm going to see if I can clean it up even more. So secant squared is 1 over cosine, and cotangent is cosine squared over sine squared. So these cosines are going to reduce off, and I'm left with negative 2 over sine squared, which is negative 2 cosecant squared of x. Either that answer or this answer is perfectly fine.